Good evening, everyone. It's the first time doing this in almost 2 years. I'm very glad to see so many of you here this evening. It's our first in-person lecture since March 2020, and a very exciting one, as you can see, to launch the exhibition Imperial Splendor, the art of the book in the Holy Roman Empire, 800 to 1500, a sweeping magisterial overview of the topic drawn exclusively from North American collections. And for those who've seen it, you need to see it many times. We're delighted that the co-curator and one of the great forces behind the project, Jeffrey Hamburger, is with us this evening, and he will give this inaugural program. Of course, we are also hugely indebted to Joshua O'Driscoll, Dr. O'Driscoll, who is our assistant curator in the Department of Medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. And Joshua has been a splendid partner in this project, and we will be hearing from him, I think, almost every day as the show is on, because he's so engaged and enthusiastic. An exhibition like this has drawn upon the support of so many people, and it's, as this inaugural lecture, I'm very pleased to announce them and to thank them. The project was supported very much at the beginning by the Janine Luke and Melvin Seeden Fund for exhibitions, the Ricciardi Family Exhibition Fund, the Christian Humann Foundation, and Catherine J. Rayner, a trustee. Additional support provided by the David Klein Jr. Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Fund for Research and Publications, Caroline Bacon, Elizabeth and Ralph Brown, Mr. and Mrs. Alan Goldrack, Margaret Hoffman and Tom Lentz, Professor James Marrow and Dr. Emily Rose, Mrs. Andrew Schurmeister, the Samuel Kress Foundation, Gifford Coombs, Sally Vaughan, William Vokeley, Gregory T. Clark, Bob McCarthy, and an anonymous donor. I also commend the entire team at the Morgan. Those who have seen the show will realize instantly how beautifully designed, installed, lit, labeled it is, and the contribution of our Thor Conservation Department in working with Joshua on mounting and the openings and the appropriate housing for these works, very precious works, is really part of why the exhibition is so effective and so beautiful. As many of you know, but it doesn't hurt to remind, Jeffrey Hamburger is the Kuno Francke Professor of German Art and Culture, the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard. His major research interests include the art of female monasticism in the Middle Ages, interconnections between art, mysticism, theology, and science in the Middle Ages, the history of diagrams, medieval manuscript illumination generally, and including issues of text and image. His CV is 17 pages and is impressive. I'm going to just summarize quickly. He has received awards by the National Endowment of the Humanities and the Guggenheim Fellowship. He's been recipient of the Annalisa Mehrer Research Award, the Humboldt Foundation, and is a fellow of the Medieval Academy, member of the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'll end by just noting that Jeffrey Hamburger has been a force in bringing collections in both America and in Germany to show their medieval collections, to document them, to exhibit them, and to publish them. And there have been an impressive roster of exhibitions in Boston, in Munich, and I've experienced myself his enthusiasm and his energy, and the exhibition that we see this evening is in large part a result of that. So please welcome to the podium Jeffrey Hamburger.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you also to all the staff of the Morgan, and especially Josh, for this wonderful collaboration that made this exhibition possible. And thank you all for coming this evening. The image is familiar, the archetypal representation of a medieval city, crowned by a castle on a hill, surrounded by a fortified wall bristling with defensive towers marking a moat, church spires punctuating its silhouette. This is the imperial city of Nuremberg, home to the artist Albrecht Dürer, the center of a commercial empire embracing all of Europe, a crossroads between east and west, north and south, and in its own view of itself, the center of the world. This famous view comes from a no less celebrated book, the Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493, of which this beautiful colored copy from the National Gallery of Art can be seen in the exhibition. Known in German as the Schädelsche Weltchronik, after its compiler, the physician and Italian-trained humanist Hartmann Schädel, who died in 1514, this immensely ambitious work was commissioned by a pair of Nuremberg merchants, Sebald Schreier and his son-in-law, Sebastian Kammermeister, and printed by Anton Koberger, Albrecht Dürer's godfather, first in the Latin and shortly thereafter in a German translation. Their names, along with those of the artists, appear in the colophon to the work. Schreier and Kammermeister essentially played a role equivalent to that of modern-day venture capitalists, commissioning about 1,400 Latin and 700 German copies, of which in 1509, 595 remained unsold, 90% of them unbound. Although on December 29, 1491, the two entrepreneurs signed a contract with the painter Hans Pleidenwerf and his pupil Michael Wohlgemuth, other evidence indicates that work had started previously. Wohlgemuth, seen here as portrayed by Dürer, married his teacher's widow, thereby succeeding him as the master of his large, successful workshop, in which the young Dürer received his training. The printed program of illustration, 1,809 woodcut illustrations printed from 645 blocks, was by any standard staggering in scope. This cast of characters cries out for closer consideration. Like many physicians of his time, Schädel cultivated humanist tendencies. At almost 1,000 volumes, both manuscripts and printed books, many of them illustrated with miniatures, prints, and drawings in the manner of albums, including, as you can see here, city views, in this case of Bamberg, his library, which included a Gutenberg Bible, was one of the largest in Germany. The text of the Chronicle reflects his deep learning. Among Schädel's books imported from Italy was the Supplementum Chronicarum by the Augustinian monk Giacomo Filippo Foresti da Bergamo, first printed in Venice in 1483, no more than a decade before his own chronicle was published. The Supplementum, which included a modest number of maps and city views, and which, like Schädel's, begins with the story of creation, was Schädel's most important source. Schädel's chronicle is a world chronicle, a well-established genre in the Middle Ages, of which richly illuminated versions were especially popular in Germany. In the exhibition, the genre is represented by a mid-14th century copy, illuminated in Regensburg, of the mid-13th century verse chronicle by Rudolf von Ems. The chronicle was to have extended to an explanation of the role in Salvation history of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, to which Rudolf's patron, King Conrad IV, belonged, but he died before completing his monumental task. In the Morgan's copy, the city, whether Babel or Jerusalem, often serves as a symbol of pride, vanity, or vice. Schädel's chronicle takes a decidedly different view of both the city and the world. In addition to being a physician, historian, and humanist, Schädel, who had studied at the University of Padua, took a keen interest in geography. His chronicle, after all, is a world chronicle, an established medieval genre in both Latin and the vernacular that by design embraced not only all of time, but also the ecumene, all the inhabited earth. It is in this context that his chronicle's inclusion of a world map based on Ptolemy, as well as its many city views, have to be considered. Just as the Nuremberg Chronicle was being made, the world was undergoing a complementary process of expansion and contraction. Expansion in that new worlds were being discovered, contraction in that the web of commerce that had made the city so wealthy incorporated more and more far-flung places. In 1492, only 1 year prior to the Chronicle's publication, Columbus set sail for the New World. In the same year, Martin Beheim, a widely traveled textile merchant who served as an advisor on maritime navigation to the King of Portugal and who participated in a voyage to West Africa, presented the Nuremberg City Council with his famous globe, which, although still largely based on information gleaned from Ptolemy, remains the earliest extant example of its kind. Already at the turn of the 15th century, Palla Strozzi, the richest man in Florence, had acquired an illustrated Greek manuscript of Ptolemy's geography. Beheim consulted on the production of the Chronicle, as did Hieronymus Munzer, another doctor and book collector who traveled widely in Europe, often fleeing the plague. Munzer should probably be credited for drawing up the Chronicles Map of Germany, seen here, which was based on another, here, owned by the great cardinal and scholar Nicholas of Cusa, of which a plate was engraved in 1491, albeit published only in the early 16th century. The plate, in turn, was owned by the Augsburg humanist Konrad Peutinger, a counselor to Emperor Maximilian I, who owned one of the most famous of all maps, the Tabula Peutingeriana, a late 12th century copy of a Roman itinerarium or road map. All this is simply to say that Schädel's fascination with space as well as time was very much of his time and place. Schädel worked hand in glove with Koberger, the printer, helping him to draw up manuscript models of both the Latin and German editions of the Chronicle, which were published in overlapping time spans. Given that both editions employed the same woodblocks, the intersecting workflows had to be coordinated with extraordinary precision. Koberger was no ordinary craftsman, although Nuremberg was full of such masters. He came from one of the richest patrician families in the city. He began printing around 1470. By the end of the century, he had published over 220, probably as many as 250 titles, the majority of them multi-volume or folio-sized works. It has been estimated that of the approximately 320,000 pages produced in Nuremberg prior to 1500, Koberger printed 72%. A specialist in theological and legal works, he was known for his attention to textual accuracy, often collating as many as 20 manuscript sources from all over Germany for a single imprint. Koberger was typical of wealthy Nuremberg merchants in that he exploited the city's commercial network to sell copies of his publications all over Europe. His vast house on the Aegidienplatz in Nuremberg could accommodate as many as 24 presses and 100 workers. Separate models for the Latin and German editions of the Chronicle were written out by 4 and 6 scribes, respectively. In the manuscript models, sketchy impressionistic illustrations served as aids in laying out the pages, not as designs for the woodcuts from which they often differ in essential respects. As finally printed, the work employed as many as 11 different layouts. Those with elaborate floral elements connecting figural vignettes, which were often used to express biblical genealogies, were eventually abandoned or simplified, in part because the process of ensuring the coordination of their various parts proved too costly. When one considers, as can be seen from this somewhat speculative workflow diagram, first, that Koberger had at least half a dozen other editions in production at the time the Chronicle was being printed, and second, that the printing process, including the production of the vast number of illustrations, commenced before either model was complete, one gets a sense of the logistical complexity of the enterprise. This complex, yet only partial picture of the collaboration that produced the Chronicle would not be complete without consideration of the two artists, Wohlgemuth and Pleidenwurf, who oversaw the production of the pictorial program. A drawing for the frontispiece, dated 1490, and hence predating the contract, provides the earliest dated evidence for the production process. The verso was written by Georg Alt, who translated the Chronicle from Latin into German. It represents a draft of the geographical section that later was shifted to another location in the volume. In its place was printed the prologue to the first part of the Chronicle, a summary of the 6 days of creation, which I show you here in the National Gallery's illuminated copy. Intimidating though the commission of the Chronicle must have been, both Pleidenwerth and Wolgemuth were experienced when it came to the mass production of images, not only prints, but also altarpieces, large and small, which their shops exported all over Central Europe. Already in 1491, they had provided Coburger with 96 full-page woodcuts from 91 blocks for Stefan Friedelin's Schatzbehalter, or Treasury of the True Riches of Salvation, a retelling of the life of Christ in text and image. For this work also a model exists. None of this would have been possible without numerous assistants, of whom in the case of Pleidenwerth, Albrecht Dürer was one, although whether he had any role in the production of the Chronicle remains an open question. The painters were responsible for the transfer of their designs to the blocks, which were then cut by specialists, one of whom, Sebald Gallensdorfer, is known by name. Despite all this, we don't know what it would have cost to purchase a copy of the final product. The accounts of Peter Drach, a contemporary printer in Speyer, indicate that a missal could cost anywhere from 4 to 16 gulden, that is gold coins, depending on whether it was printed on paper or parchment. These prices, however, were for books that had been bound, which added to the cost considerably. For the sake of comparison, a professional scribe might earn 32 gulden or florins per annum. In 1509, Albrecht Dürer purchased his large house in Nuremberg for 275 florins. From this map and view, you can see just how close our dramatis personae lived to one another. Collaboration was as easy as dropping in on the neighbor. A small devotional triptych in the exhibition, a gem of a painting, underscores the extent to which the complex collaborations that enabled production of the Chronicle informed work across various media in late medieval Nuremberg. Painted during the 1480s by a skilled assistant in Pleidenwerth's circle, the triptych presents a polished and imaginative interpretation of a tradition of narrative altarpieces against a unified landscape background that had its origins in Netherlandish painting. In addition to a repertory of motifs that circulated in Pleidenwerth's workshop, the work draws on others that were filtered through the engravings of Martin Schongauer. The panel was commissioned by the Nuremberg Patrician Georg Stark, who in an oft-repeated pattern in 1457 retired to the city's Carthusian monastery. The triptych's interior, whose sweep belies its small size, gives a good sense of the pictorial resources that informed the creation of the city views in the Nuremberg Chronicle. A continuous landscape reaching from a rocky outcrop and barren trees on the left across distant prominences to the more proximate hills on the right charts a steady progression of space. It also opens up the foreground at the center so that the spot on which the cross is planted marks a Christian omphalos, the navel of the world, at which all 4 directions, marked by converging chiastic diagonals, converge. The progression across the panels also marks the passage of time, from the brilliantly illuminated atmospheric sky that once the cross stands upright will lie to the left of Christ's body, but on his privileged right side, where his disciples, most prominently the fainting Virgin Mary, the Veronica, and in the foreground the grieving Magdalene, are gathered, to the roiling dark clouds, a motif often employed by Dürer, that fill the sky above belated witnesses, such as the mounted centurion who gestures to the rising Christ, to the more meditative figures at the lower right, including the thief, his arms tied behind his back, who contemplates the rough-hewn crosses on which he too will be hoisted. The meteorological division of space also marks the division of time by the pending eclipse that will occur at the moment of Christ's imminent death, when, like the cross, which is about to fall into its allotted spot, all of history, from a Christian perspective, will suddenly make sense. The taut lines held by Christ's tormentors serve not only their immediate function within the narrative, they also make the composition in statu ascendi legible to the viewer, for whom the triptych served, probably, not as an altarpiece, but rather as a devotional focal point. Two pyramidal diagonals, one nested within the other, unite the complex array of figures into a single eloquent arrangement, dynamic and monumental at the same time. Despite being immured in a Carthusian cloister, the powerful composition had an impact on contemporary painting, both through copies and preparatory studies. Among the testimonies to its reputation is a drawing in the Morgan's collection depicting Golgotha before the crucifixion, dated around 1490 and attributed to an illuminator known as the Herpen Master. The idiosyncratic viewpoint in a scene as canonical as the crucifixion, one thinks of somewhat later works by Altdorfer and Cranach, introduces a strong subjective perspective, one that in the drawing is further enacted within the image by the spectators who have clambered high into the tree that serves as a repoussoir, creating a more pronounced sense of depth. The confluence of creativity and commerce, the concentration of so much talent and enterprise in what remained the small space of the city, whose population at the time the Chronicle was printed numbered barely 20,000, immediately brings to mind the city of Florence at the height of the Renaissance. Let us then enter the city of Nuremberg through the image provided to us by the Chronicle. To the right, atop a high bluff at the northern periphery of the city, stands the Burg, or Imperial Castle, which often hosted visiting German kings and emperors. In many respects, the history of this castle encapsulates that of the city. According to legend, the outcrop on which it stood had been the site of a camp of Nero Claudius Drusus, son of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, hence its name, derived from Neronisberg. The first fortified buildings on the site were erected around the year 1000. Over time, the city spread down the slope of the hill to the south towards the Pegnitz River. At first, this castle belonged to the emperors, later to the burgraves, who ruled the county of which the city was the center, until the city gained independence in 1219. By 1313, Emperor Henry VII had ceded control of the castle to the city council. The emperor, however, maintained a presence in the city. Under Louis the Bavarian, Henry's successor as Holy Roman Emperor, and Charles IV, that is from 1314 to 1378, the peripatetic court visited the city 126 times, often for months at a time. In the Golden Bull, promulgated in Nuremberg in 1356, which canonized governance of the empire, Charles stipulated that the newly elected German kings should hold their first imperial diet in the city. He himself visited the city on over 50 occasions. The mechanism of the clock, added in 1509 to the facade of the Frauenkirche, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and built by Charles on the new market square between 1352 and 1356, which is known as the Männleinlaufen, or the mechanism of the little men, commemorates the Golden Bull at midday by having the 7 electors parade around the figure of the emperor to the sound of trumpeters and drummers. Nuremberg enjoyed a special status among the Reichsstädte, or imperial cities, which owed no allegiance to anyone but the emperor, not only on account of its central location, but also its growing wealth, which meant that it paid an imperial tax comparable to that of the prince-electors, the so-called Kurfürsten, of which there were 7. You see them here in the Codex Balduini, the archbishops of Cologne, Mainz, and Trier, for whose 14th century Archbishop Balduin the manuscript is named, as well as the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia, who from the 13th century onward elected a monarch who was then crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. The meetings at which such elections and other legislative business were conducted were known as Reichstage, literally the days of the emperor, the same name that until the end of World War II was used for the German Parliament building in Berlin. The oldest part of the castle is that we can see to the left in the Chronicles view. Here lay the palace and the double, that is, two-storied Imperial Chapel, or Aula Palatina, literally Imperial Hall, as in the Palatine Hill in Rome, the origin of our word palace. The two-story structure, which dates to the 13th century, was less a concession to the steep and narrow topography of the site than it was a traditional way of separating the monarch and his closest associates from the remainder of the court. This upstairs-downstairs arrangement is the same as that found in the grander chapels such as Charlemagne's at Aachen and the Sainte-Chapelle, once at the heart of Louis IX's palace on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. Only remnants of the chapel's furnishings, including a crucifix by Weitstoss, survive. Also portions of the left side altarpiece donated by Emperor Friedrich III in 1487, just before work on the Nuremberg Chronicle got started, seen here in an old photograph. Statues from the ensemble depict Charlemagne, the saintly Emperor Henry II, his sainted wife Kunigunde, and the finder of the true cross, the Emperor Helena, wife of the first Christian Emperor Constantine, whose story also appears on the Stavelot triptych here at the Morgan. Portraits of the donor Frederick and his son, the future Emperor Maximilian, adorn the door leading from the palace to the chapel. To the left of the castle, the Chronicles view identifies two churches, each crowned by a pair of towers. In fact, far apart, as can be seen from comparison with this modern view. That immediately down the slope is dedicated to St. Sebald, the city's patron saint, who died only around 1070, shortly after the city's foundation. Although Sebald was officially canonized only in 1425, his church was first erected around 1225, not long after Emperor Friedrich II had granted the city its freedom in the charter. Oops, that's St. Sebald, and there's the charter. In the charter that you see here. The church stood in front of the old city hall. The late Gothic chancel dates to the second half of the 14th century. The upper parts of the towers, clearly distinguished in the Chronicle, to the 15th. The Church of St. Sebald lent its name to this entire section of the city, the Sebalderstadt. This is where Albrecht Dürer, whose house, seen here from the church's towers, was around the corner, attended services. Across the river Pegnitz, which in the Chronicles view can be seen at the lower right, flowing out of the fortified Haller Gate, there grew up a rival parish around the Church of St. Lawrence. It was founded around 1250, and as in the case of its competitor, construction continued into the 15th century. As you can see, the print accurately registers the stylistic distinction between the lower Romanesque sections of the towers and their upper Gothic portions, completed in 1477. To this day, both churches, Sebald and Lawrence, remain crammed with works of art commissioned by prominent patrician families that document both civic pride and familial rivalry. In the case of St. Lawrence, the Geese book, the latest manuscript in the exhibition, and also the largest, represents but one of these many commissions. Most of this decoration grew by accretion, the result of the privatization of communal space. When the aisles of both churches were widened, the resulting bays were almost immediately occupied by private chapels that then were filled with dedicated altars and epitaphs. Keeping up with the Joneses is hardly a modern phenomenon. Tucked deep into the Chronicle's panoramic presentation of the city is one of its most important monuments, the Frauenkirche, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Located on the main market square, it is only a hop and a skip from St. Sebald's. Its unobtrusiveness is attributable to its relatively low profile. It appears more prominently, however, immediately above the head of John the Evangelist in another such view, only slightly later in date, incorporated into the background of a crucifixion, also in the exhibition, that originally served as the canon page prefacing the prayers of consecration in a missal. Although the subject calls for a view of Jerusalem as seen from the high point of Golgotha in the foreground, a motif introduced into northern painting by the Flemish artist Jan van Eyck, and therefore dubbed by art historians the highlands in the lowlands, the city takes on the recognizable form of Nuremberg. The illuminated leaf adopts the view from the west, the opposite of the eastern viewpoint employed in the Nuremberg Chronicle, and incorporates many recognizable details. These include the portcullis gates hanging from the lower and upper branches of the 15th century bridge flanking the Trödelmarktinsel, originally a meat, not a flea market, in keeping with its current name, and spanning the branches of the river Pegnitz, to the right of the head of John the Evangelist, and just above it, the gabled facade of the Frauenkirche, designed by the architect of Prague Cathedral, Peter Parler, and built between 1352 and 62 by Charles IV on the site of the old synagogue, which was destroyed in 1349 during a pogrom at the time of the Black Death, in which 560 Jews were burned to death, after which the emperor exonerated the town council and had the ghetto destroyed to make way for the marketplace, now the site of the city's famous Christmas market. Most visitors, one assumes, remain utterly oblivious to the history of the site, which also serves as the backdrop to the city. Most visitors, one assumes, remain oblivious to the history of the site. In its meticulous rendition of topographical details, the landscape in the crucifixion rivals and perhaps emulates the topographical drawings and watercolors produced by Dürer while crossing the Alps on the first of his two trips to Italy, 1494-5, which he too incorporated into religious and allegorical subjects. Following the baptism of Wenzel IV in the nearby church of St. Sebald in 1361, the Reichskleinodien, the insignia of the Reich, were displayed from the balcony on the Frauenkirche's west facade, which also served as a platform for the display of the collection of relics donated by the emperor. After 1423, when as a result of the Hussite Wars, the insignia, now housed in the Schatzkammer, or Imperial Treasury in Vienna, were removed from Prague, first to Hungary, then at the command of Emperor Sigismund to the Hospital of the Holy Ghost in Nuremberg, they were, on special occasions, usually after Easter during the city's most important fair, displayed from a wooden platform, you see it here, in the market in front of the church. As in other contexts, cult and commerce went hand in hand. Let us continue our tour of the city with the Chronicle as our guide. In the left foreground stands the Frauentor, the Woman's Gate, surmounted by the double-headed eagle identifying the city as a Reichsstadt. In the right foreground stands the Hallertor. A tinted drawing by Dürer, dated 1496, shows the fortifications and covered bridge from within the city walls. The precision of Dürer's recording lays bare the Chronicle's simplifications. Across the river in the woodcut's lower right corner stands the paper mill of Ullmann-Stromer, since 1390 the first paper mill north of the Alps, a reminder that the predilection for working on this relatively inexpensive support, of which Dürer provides the principal example, was not without its roots in the city. Between the two gates stands a Beichtenmartyr, or confessional crucifixion, within a stele crowned by a protective gable and a Golgotha marked by 3 crosses, of which that in the center is hung with the Arma Christi, the instruments of the Passion. Among these was thought to have been the Holy Lance, believed to have been the lance with which the centurion Longinus had pierced the side of Christ, and one of the imperial insignia housed in the city since 1422. Both the Stele and the Golgotha, together with the raised platform to the right, the so-called Rabenstein, where criminals were beheaded, mark the site as a place of execution. Small images on paper or parchment of the Sacred Heart, known as spear pictures, would, by virtue of their having been pierced on the tip of the lance, become potent contact relics and were sold as souvenirs for pilgrims. The inscription pointedly reads not "this image," but rather, "this heart was pierced with the lance of our Lord, Jesus Christ," thereby collapsing any distinction between image and the object of representation. From this overview, we can see how the Chronicle's view of the city codifies its sacred and political topography. At 53 centimeters wide and 34 centimeters tall, the view it offers is both more compact and more vertical than it would have been in reality, as can be seen by comparison with the later view with a much lower horizon. Even had the Chronicle been printed on still larger paper, and we know that its planned dimensions were twice reduced, the way in which the city is depicted can only in part be attributed to practical considerations. Although the panorama occupies the whole of the two-page spread to the exclusion of any text and had to be printed in two pulls from the press that were later joined together, a tricky business given the need to ensure that not only the image but also the text printed on the reverse sides would match or register, it was still necessary to alter the city's proportions. What the alterations also allowed, however, was for the city to acquire a prominence it otherwise would not have possessed. The approximate symmetry and placement of the symbolic Golgotha at the foot of the actual hill occupied by the city is not accidental. Nuremberg is marked as a New Jerusalem. Without being facetious, one could say that the view of Nuremberg in the Chronicle affirms the city's image of its own importance no less than does Saul Steinberg's famous New Yorker cover, but without any attendant hint of irony. The Chronicle's identification of Nuremberg as a city of central political as well as religious significance is confirmed by the city's placement within the book. Comparison of the final imprints with the manuscript model in which the work was laid out makes clear that a deliberate effort was made to ensure that Schädel's city, originally planned for folios 119 verso to 120 recto, would appear on 99 verso to 100 recto towards the beginning of the sixth age of world history, that beginning with the birth of Christ. In the German model, the rendering of the city is more schematic still, although in placing a single large gate on the central axis, neither sketch corresponds to the final version. Note, however, that whereas in the Latin model the pagination underwent repeated adjustments in favor of the round number 100, by the time the German model was produced, this matter had been settled. To divide world chronicles into sections according to the ages of the world represented a traditional approach to the history of salvation, one we find reflected in diagrammatic images such as this one from a late medieval encyclopedia in verse. Schädel adopts the scheme according to which the ages, each different in length, are named for Adam and Noah, shown here, then Abraham, David, the Babylonian captivity, and the birth of Christ. No less traditional is the way in which he gives his native city a central role in this history. For example, the Konstanzer Weltchronik, seen here in a copy in the New York Public Library, relates the history of the world from creation right down to the present, with one of the culminating events being the earthquake of 1348, concurrent with the Black Death, that caused landslides and a flood that destroyed much of the city. As constructed by the Chronicle, this cataclysmic event not only echoed the earthquake that, according to the Gospels, took place at the crucifixion, it also anticipated the 15 signs of the Last Judgment, to which the manuscript devotes several impressive two-page spreads. Other world chronicles also devoted considerable space to geography. Schädel's, however, stood apart on account of the sheer number of city views included within its conspectus, 53 in all. A distant antecedent is provided by the 8th century mosaic floor of the Byzantine church of St. Stephen in al-Razas in Jordan. Surrounding the vine in the large central panel, the frame consists of the most important cities of the region, including Philadelphia, modern-day Amman, Nablus, Caesarea, and Gaza. The cities, however, are effectively interchangeable. While varied, they are not topographically specific. Not all the city views in the Nuremberg Chronicle are accurate either. Whereas 32 are, to some extent, authentic, or better, sporadically specific, here, for example, Rome and Venice, 21 are entirely fictive. Moreover, some are repeated, standing in for as many as 5 different cities. The same image is used for Mainz, Aquileia, Bologna, and Lyon. The same holds true for Trier, Padua, Marseille, Nicaea, and Lithuania. Other images were repeated as well. For example, representations of popes, emperors, church councils, and my favorite, the burning of heretics. The printing process precluded any of these images standing in close proximity to one another. A single block could not serve in 2 presses simultaneously. In so ambitious a work, it is hardly surprising that some redundancy was built in. The phenomenon, however, had more than practical implications. The contrast between topographically specific and stereotypical views, while not hard and fast, witness the symbolic elements embedded within an otherwise specific view of Nuremberg, underscores the contrast between 2 different ways of seeing the world, on the one hand as sign and symbol, on the other as an arena for empirical experience. In German painting, topographical views had been incorporated into the backgrounds of sacred subjects from the first half of the 15th century, a famously precocious example being Konrad Witz's view of the Alps in the Miraculous Draught of Fishes, once part of an altarpiece dedicated to St. Peter, dated 1444. The Sea of Galilee becomes Lake Geneva. The earliest view of Nuremberg, dating to the 1470s, occurs in the Krell altarpiece in the Church of St. Lawrence. Remaining in Franconia, in nearby Bamberg, Wolfgang Katzheimer's watercolors served as studies for panel paintings in which scriptural narrative was recast in a local dialect. Among the works in the exhibition, the Concordantia Caritatis, illuminated in Vienna around 1460, contains miniature views of both Vienna and, on one of the unfinished pages, Wiener Neustadt, a city view of Zurich that extended continuously over several panels, like the background in the Stark triptych, is essentially all that remains of an altarpiece by the Swiss painter Hans Loy. In this case, sawing off the top of the panels was all that was needed to secularize them following the Reformation. A deeper perspective on the city view would have to take Italy into account. Cimabue's crossing vault at Assisi from the late 1270s, in which each of the 4 evangelists filling the 4 vaults is accompanied by a city standing for the region that he evangelized, Jerusalem for Judea, Corinth for Greece, Ephesus for Asia, and Rome for Italy, provides a convenient point of departure. In its stereotypical character, the vault's 4-fold scheme remains indebted to medieval modes of representation. Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good and bad government in the Palazzo Pubblica of Siena is another such landmark, as is Francesco Rosselli's panoramic painting of the Aragonese fleet returning to Naples after the Battle of Ischia in 1465. In Netherlandish painting, milestones include Rogier van der Weyden's Bladelaan altarpiece, which sets the Nativity against the background of the Flemish city of Middelburg, founded by the rich Bruges burgher Peter Bladelaan and his wife around around 1444. As the Nativity at the heart of Bladelaan's altarpiece suggests, motivating many such views was not simply civic pride, but also religious devotion. Paintings provided vehicles for proxy pilgrimage. Jean-Duc de Berry's Très Riche, famous for the topographical features incorporated into its calendar, also includes a map of Rome based on those that guided pilgrims to the city. Images of monuments such as the Holy Sepulchre, of which numerous examples can be found in 15th century chronicles and prayer books, bear witness to the miracle of the resurrection. The Nuremberg Patrician Hans Tucher, seen here in a portrait from the Wohlgemuth workshop, painted in 1481, the year following his return from the Holy Land, wrote a widely disseminated account of his pilgrimage, which was guided by fold-up maps of the kind you see here. Hans's brother, Endres, a member of the city's inner council, and prior to his retirement, the city's master builder, moved, like Georg Stark, to the city's Carthusian monastery. Following her husband's retreat, his wife Adelheid returned to her native Bamberg, where she died in 1482. Her epitaph, painted in the Katzheimer workshop, bears the powerful imprint of her brother-in-law's pilgrimage. The background consists of a remarkably detailed representation of the city of Jerusalem. A late product of this tradition, itself an antecedent of such works as Rembrandt's Night Watch, is the remarkable group portrait by Jan van Scorel of 12 members, sodality based on the apostolic number, of the Haarlem Brotherhood of Jerusalem, in which a servant holds aloft a painting within the painting in the form of an inscribed representation of the Holy Sepulchre. The artist, who like all the other members of the Brotherhood had completed a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, is the third figure from the right. In light of these precedents, it should therefore come as no surprise that the most important model for the city views in Schädel's Chronicle took the form of an ambitious pilgrimage publication, Bernhard von Breidenbach's Peregrinatio in Terram Sanctam, published in Mainz in 1483. Breidenbach had his work illustrated with woodcuts by Erhard Reuwig, from whom he took along on the trip with this specific purpose in mind, and who, in a first in the history of printing, was credited with their creation in the book's preface. Breidenbach's work anticipated Schädel's, not only in its inclusion of panoramic city views, so broad in fact that they required foldouts with flaps, but also in its international distribution. The Chronicle's view of Heraklion and Crete, Rhodes, and Jerusalem all draw on Reuwig's exemplars. Breidenbach's bestseller appeared in Latin, German, and Dutch editions, and before 1500 it was translated into French, Spanish, and Czech. Another such work, never printed but extant in 4 illustrated manuscripts, is Konrad Grunenberg's account of his pilgrimage, which in 1486 took him from Constance to Jerusalem and back over 33 weeks. Grunenberg's illustrations also draw in part on Breidenbach's example. No less than Schädel's Chronicle, such books were made for armchair travelers. Had the artists of the Chronicle actually visited all the cities it depicts, they would have had to travel over 1,500 kilometers. Proof that the Chronicle inspired imaginary travels comes from an unexpected quarter. In the first literary record of the Faust legend, published in 1587, the protagonist flies on his cloak from Trier to Paris to Mainz to Naples. Why so indirect a route? Because this is the sequence in which these 4 city views occur in the Chronicle. In our exhibition, the section on Nuremberg, of which Schädel's Chronicle is one of the highlights, marks the end of a survey of painting in the German-speaking world, stretching back the better part of a millennium. I would therefore like to conclude with a very brief look back. As we have seen, although the Chronicle's city views are usually held up to represent a radical departure from the medieval vision of the city, they too, like the Chronicle as a whole, employ age-old stereotypes to lend meaning and structure to the reader's experience. They nonetheless stand on the cusp of novel ways of seeing and framing the world. In this 12th century German manuscript, the image of Jerusalem represents a cross between a map, a diagram, and an image. In lieu of particulars, we are presented with a type. In this respect, it resembles the representations of Rome and Jerusalem from the Liber Floridus, an early 12th century compendium of sacred and secular history, combined with a good deal of natural history in the form of maps. The Liber Floridus, whose names liken its contents to a bouquet of flowers carefully culled by its author, is an earlier representative of the genre to which the Nuremberg Chronicle belongs. The images deliberately invite a form of conceptual superimposition constituting a typology. We can identify the source of such images, city seals, in which individual identity and typology were also fused into one. We can reach back still further to the Roman surveying manual known as the Codex Agrimensorum, known to the medieval West in the form of late antique and Carolingian copies. Its pages include a schematic representation of a Roman town or encampment nestled within a landscape, but superimposed on the grid of a cadastre plan, and twice bisected in orange by the Cardo and Decumanus that, like the empire itself, impose order on unruly nature. This image of man-made order appealed to medieval artists, who took it in turn as a model for their images of the heavenly city, as in this evangelist portrait from a 9th century gospel book. We find the same will to order in images of the heavenly Jerusalem, for example, in the Morgan Library's 8th century Beatus, a commentary on the book of Revelation, in which the city's 12 gates, identified with the 12 apostles, are flattened out to form a perfect grid. In this city view, the only perspective that matters is divine. Medieval Nuremberg had 7 gates, but in the Chronicles view, we can only see 2. And here I can't resist remarking that in typical German fashion, the city employed a system of color-coded letters for these gates, also employed for the organization of documents, so as to ensure that defenders of the city would report to their proper positions. In the Beatus, what matters is that we can see all 12 simultaneously, a perfect number that matches the number of apostles surrounding the Lamb of God. All maps involve some degree of abstraction, but in contrast to modern mapping, medieval maps and city views aspired to almost diagrammatic clarity corresponding to the convictions that underpinned their view of the cosmos. Much in the Nuremberg Chronicle remains captive to medieval traditions, and we no longer celebrate the discovery of the New World as emblematic of the march of progress. Nonetheless, the Nuremberg Chronicle, published but 1 year after Columbus's fateful voyage, marks the moment at which the Old World broke its bounds. The Chronicle, therefore, represents a fitting endpoint to our exhibition and to this lecture. Thank you.